Good day, everyone. As stated, my name is Siphokazi Jonas, and my contribution to this conversation is as director, co-writer, and cast member of We're Dying Here. This poetry and music theatre production speaks to the culture of violence in South Africa, to gender-based violence and femicide in particular. My frame of reference is in thinking about how we have used this artistic intervention to engage with language when speaking of trauma and how trauma shapes our language. I'll exemplify the possibilities which the arts can offer life orientation educators in two ways. Firstly, in introspecting and confronting one's own positioning and language based on personal experiences with gender based violence. Secondly, in thinking how to facilitate those conversations in the classroom with this new and heightened awareness of your own position. As one audience member put it, before we can even think about how to engage an issue like this in the classroom, educators need to ask themselves, what kind of work do I need to do in order to facilitate my own healing? And how has my own trauma shaped my views and responses to gender-based violence? What I'm going to do is I'm going to share two poems as provocations for discussion and draw connections, which I hope will then open something up that is unexpected. The first poem which I wrote is called Thanks for the Hashtag But, and is the poem which actually inspired our production. Thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet. Between taxi rank, construction site, and street, only enough time to clutch your bag to your body to yourself, and yourself to this thought, please don't talk to me. 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 Thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet in the boardroom or by the photocopy machine. Power pinches the purse strings and makes you puppet, and everybody knows the puppet master's hands like to slip below the neck, below the hem, below the waist. But the show must go on, so the audience claps and claps and claps its way to a 13th check. Thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet in vestry or confession booth. Scriptures are interpreted behind smoke screens, behind a collar and a robe, and the pulpit is now a bookshelf of bodies and strange fires, and God was cast out a long time ago to make space. Thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet in parliament or in court. They're in the business of cooking laws to serve justice to the vulnerable, but first, a few questions to prove your innocence. Did you say no? Do your clothes say no? Your life, your values, your virtues? How long have you lived as a no? And so the courts decide that when you said no or couldn't say it at all, you really meant yes. And here what matters is not what you say, but what he believes he heard. Thanks for the hashtag, but there's no time to tweet. There's no network here. Data is expensive here. How do you explain Twitter here, or a hashtag for that matter, when my cousin, my aunt, and my grandmother don't speak English here? There's no time to tweet here. The police ask what I did to deserve it here. The docket is for sale here. They receive parole here. The family wants to solve this as a family here. They pay damages to make things right here. The lecturer fails you here. The principal is king here. The prophet is father here. The breadwinner must not be questioned here. The bread must not be endangered here. The neighbors mind their own business here. They say, I'll ruin the family here. They say, bekezela here. They say, don't try, be clever here. They say, they'll teach me a lesson here. They say, they want to fix me here. They say, smile here. The trend is, we are dying here. The second poem I want to read is by the co-writer of the production, as well as fellow performer, Hope Nechibambe. And it goes as follows. I watched my mother learn a new language in her old age. Her tongue did not startle in her mouth. I didn't know you could teach someone a language you are not fluent in. It was my father who taught my mother. He taught her syllables with his hands, taught her metaphors with his absence. He embedded jargons on her wrists, put an accent on her throat, loved it when she spoke, couldn't understand when she spoke, loved the sound of it anyway. My mother sounds like weeping when she speaks. The earth vibrates when tears fall from her face. Anger erupts in me when she is sad. I want to become lightning when she mourns. I want to strike my father on his chest, forbid him not to speak, although I have many questions. My tongue cannot move when I am raging anger towards him. He taught me a language too, one he is fluent in. His tongue cannot move when there is blood on the door handle, so he counts on his feet to walk away. My father is leaving, but he never takes his suitcase with him. Doesn't know how to be completely gone, doesn't know how to stay. He hates the sight of blood. Our faces tore from all his walking away. He cannot stand looking at us. I don't know what language or languages he was taught when growing up, but I think he mastered them all. That second poem was by, as I said, my co-writer and cast member Hope Nichibambe. So these two poems in different ways really speak to this connection between language and trauma, a connection that happens both within the private space, if we're thinking about our homes, as well as in the public sphere, and how it affects us, how we embody that connection between language and trauma. And when thinking about these two elements, I invite you not only to think about what is spoken, but perhaps in a more powerful way of silence and silencing. Hope speaks in her poem a number of times about tongues which cannot move. Her own tongue which cannot move, her mother's tongue which cannot move, and her father who speaks a language that he was taught when growing up. She doesn't know what that language is, but somehow thinks that he's mastered them all. In the first poem, there's a line that says, "There's no time to tweet here. There's no network here. Data is expensive here. How do you explain Twitter or a hashtag for that matter when my aunt, my grandmother, and my cousin don't speak English here?" And so while this particular poem alludes to English, it's really thinking about access. It's thinking about economic structures that don't allow for access. When we think about the way in which social media allows hashtags and trends to move and to make sure that there's a conversation happening around gender-based violence, a conversation happening on the stories of those who are lost. But in between all of those, there are many stories that are missing. There are many names which are not said, but there are many people who are not even able to access platforms like Facebook, like Twitter, who are not actually participating in the same way within that language, which is not to say that they are not speaking, but it's at least helps us to think about how silence itself can travel, but how silence is occupied by many things. It's informed by a number of things. And in a very interesting way, what Hope does in her poem is also to speak to the violence, the physical violence of silencing. And I think she does it so beautifully in a way that any poetry or English class or English teacher, I think, would really appreciate. And I just want to read from there again, where she says, "I didn't know you could teach someone a language you are not fluent in." Clearly, she's not alluding simply to what is spoken. "It was my father who taught my mother. He taught her syllables with his hands, taught her metaphors with his absence. He embeds jargons on her wrists, put an accent on her throat, loved it when she spoke, and yet couldn't understand when she spoke." The way in which she frames within this intimate relationship, she frames the relationship between the trauma and the language, that there's a new language that's being learned as a result of trauma. It means there are different ways in which we should try and listen to this new language which has been taught, to think about the way in which the language of fear and trauma is also a form of silencing. But also, while Hope's poem speaks to silence through physical and emotional violence, including absence, the earlier poem speaks to a kind of systematic violence. There are stories of entire villages in South Africa that do not have police stations, which make reporting crime difficult, and that's a form of systematic violence. It seems that maybe one story may not be worth telling, if you have to travel long distances to be able to simply lay a case. And in this earlier poem, the speaker says, the police, so that even if you're able to have access, even if you're able to finally walk through the doors of a police station, you come to the counter and the response you receive is, what did you do to deserve it? These are the same police stations where dockets are lost, where perpetrators receive parole. And so there's a systematic violence that accompanies even the intimate violence that happens within our families. And all of these different languages, all of these different silences, and I think they're multiple and varying in nature, all of these are those that we as educators bring into the classroom, as well as the learners bring into the classroom. And it's really thinking about what that space looks like in trying to engage with what we bring in. Hence the first question of, as an educator, before you can even teach a life orientation class, it's important to ask the question, how can I heal? What is the work that I need to do to facilitate in unpacking my own language that I've learned? The language that you may not be aware of that creates certain blind spots when it comes to having this conversation or speaking about this topic in particular. The other aspect of silence and language is the fear of ostracization, where, as the poem says, the neighbors mind their own business, or in office spaces, in work environments, in churches, places of worship, there's this sense of the show must go on, so that even once someone has had the courage to actually speak, there's a sense that the show must go on. It's almost an inconvenience. The question again for educators is, if there is a situation where a learner confesses something, how do we allow ourselves to sit quietly and not allow business as usual, not allow the sense of the show must go on so we can get on with our lives outside of the inconvenience of someone expressing their trauma. So this fear is one of the things that also silences people. We cannot think about language and trauma without thinking about trauma and silence, without thinking about our own silences, the silence in our communities, the silence in our families, the silence in our schools, and the silence in our legal systems. But even if we do think that once we've created a space where it might be safe to speak, we encounter a different challenge, and that's the actual inadequacy of language. We cannot think about trauma and language without admitting that language itself is inadequate in describing the effects of trauma. But it's important also to note that this difficulty of expression is on the part of language itself and not the victim. In the book Speaking Trauma, Constance Dellenberg says, the fragmented, silence-riddled language of the trauma victim is in part a limitation of speech, not of the speaker. And then she recounts this case between a therapist and a victim of trauma, where they're sitting in the office of the therapist and they're having a conversation, but there seems to be a breakdown in their communication, and most of it is riddled with silence because it's difficult for the therapist to get the victim to speak. And she says that in the trauma of struggling to make themselves heard, both of them, in that moment, both the language and the silence are misinterpreted. She recounts her observation of this breakdown by saying, Dr. B, who's the therapist, believes that Lisa, the victim of trauma, she believes that Lisa's silence is as a result of her shame and resistance. And as the therapist, she feels incompetent to fight it. So the way in which the therapist interprets the silence is that it is as a result of shame and resistance, and as the therapist, Dr. B feels that she cannot fight the silence. On the other side, Lisa believes that Dr. B's silence is disrespect, and she feels shame in her response. So you have these two people who are coming from a different perspective, misinterpreting each other's silence, misinterpreting the language as well. But what's interesting is that as an outsider, Dellenberg looks at the two, and in speaking with the two of them, Dellenberg realizes that the silence on both parts is as a result of profound loneliness, which both of them seem to have. And it's possible as educators to misinterpret both language and silence in our classrooms. But this loneliness, I believe, is one which we share as educators and learners. And so I want to invite you as educators to imagine how your life orientation classes can be a space which allows for both silence and speech. And I invite you to be okay with the discomfort that this will yield. As a friend of mine says, it is important to sit in the discomfort, waiting for whatever language will emerge as a gift of time. Thank you very much.